What's going on, everybody? Welcome to Political Fight Club. I'm Robert Durden, and this is our book club day. We're going to be going over Chapter 5 of Matt Taibbi's The Divide. I've got it right here. And it's a great book so far. Highly recommend. This is a very long chapter. That's why it took me a while to get the episode to you guys. I wanted to figure out a way to write it as concisely as possible. It's a 50-page chapter or so. It's called Border Trouble Part 1. And I'm going to break it down into about 3 different parts here, all following 3 different immigrants and their stories. And I'm going to try to teach you guys some stuff along the way. I'll try to keep it about 20-25 minutes, maybe a little bit less. So let's start off with, I'm just going to thank my new patron, Amro. Thank you very much. Much appreciated. Nothing without my patrons and my subs. Love all you guys. So this chapter is going to be following 3 different characters. The first one is a woman named Ella, and these are not their real names. They're just what they're called in the book. She came to the United States. She was a doctor in Mexico, and her husband was deported when she was here. And through her story, you get to understand how people are often voluntarily led to be deported through what's called a stipulated order of removal. We're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about Rule 287G, which works to deputize everybody that's a law enforcement officer in the country basically as an ICE member, so they can basically arrest and deport illegal immigrants for almost nothing at all. And then we're going to talk about the second character. His name's Alvaro, and he was a Colombian American who was deported as Mexican, even though he had deported to Mexico, even though that's not where he's from. And the shenanigans he had to go through. He got picked up by a gang once he was there, and then they ransomed him back to the United States. And that sheds some light on how that all works, with like gangs picking up people they know they can leverage back to their American family or family in America for money. So there's like this extra business going on down there. And then the last thing, they talk about a woman named Natividad. And she again moves here with her husband when she was very young, in her teens, and they raised a family here together. And her husband was deported, and she was left with 6 kids, trying to get them all to school. And there's a really, really draconian law that doesn't allow, in certain areas, and many areas still, does not allow undocumented immigrants to get driver's licenses. So what police will do is they'll profile people in certain areas where they know a lot of undocumented immigrants live in their cars, and just pull them over for no reason, and then arrest them and deport them or get them involved with ICE, simply because they know that most of these people don't have driver's licenses, because they're not allowed to have driver's licenses. It's against the law. So it's really, really messed up, but that's what the episode's going to be about in those 3 parts. So let's talk real quickly about Gainesville. I'm going to start off talking a little bit about MLK and the taxi companies there, and it'll make sense to you when we talk about 287G here in a second. Gainesville has 34,000 people and 8 taxi companies, all of them Latino-owned, despite the fact that the majority of the town is white. The company Jose drives for, Fiesta Taxi, owned by a local resident named Jose Diaz, is a functioning, profitable business. But this Latino company is a political act in its way too, an echo of the private taxi services MLK Jr. and the Montgomery Improvement Association set up back in 1955 during the famed bus boycott. Back in King's Day, black men and women rode black-owned taxis to escape segregated white bus system. In Gainesville, Latinos ride Latino-owned taxis to escape brutally punitive immigration laws that have created a disturbingly similar apartheid-like system. This small Georgia city is ground zero for the enforcement of a ferocious federal immigration rule called 287G that essentially deputizes any and all state and local law enforcement officials to arrest undocumented aliens on behalf of the United States Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, that's ICE. Today, every local official with a badge, every cop, sheriff, ranger, or even game warden has the power to instantly separate children from mothers, husbands from wives. All America, from the smallest towns on up, has become a dragnet. Initially, there was some confusion about whether 287G and a related Obama-era initiative bearing the Bush-Orwellian catchphrase "secure communities" were mandatory, or whether states could opt out. under secure communities, law enforcement officials are required to fingerprint all detainees in custody for criminal offenses and run checks on their immigration status. After the plan was announced, 2 states, Massachusetts and New York, decided in the spring of 2011 to opt out of the program, which was thought to be voluntary. A year later, Obama administration officials sent an icy email to police officials in both states informing them that they'd been opted back into the program. Secure communities, they were told, was to be activated in all remaining jurisdictions. So the idea here, guys, is that under this rule, they can deputize anybody as an ICE member if you happen to be law enforcement, no matter what kind of law enforcement you are. And as an ICE member, as a part of their unit, you can basically arrest and deport these undocumented immigrants for no reason at all. Now, Rule 287G is meant for violent crimes, okay? It's not meant to be used as a dragnet, but it is. And what they end up admitting later on, and I'll read this to you, is that after ICE started deporting so many of these Latinos back to Mexico, it was actually hurting local economies of the cities at the border, so much so that those people in those cities had to go to their city council and be like, listen, can you ease up on the 287G deportation shit? Because you're actually hurting our local economy. We need our workers back and you're deporting everybody. So it ended up coming back to bite them in a lot of these border towns that rely so heavily on these people from Mexico to actually work there. And then they ended up having to admit, yeah, the law enforcement did, that, yeah, we've been basically exercising 287G inappropriately, and we're going to try to, use it more for violent criminals. They said that out loud and in public, but then they didn't end up doing it anyway. So let's talk to you about the first young woman. Her name's Ella, and this is going to explain to you what this stipend is, the stipulated order of removal, which is a way that they get a lot of these people that they grab that are undocumented immigrants who don't know any better to voluntarily waive all their rights and go back and allow themselves to be deported. One woman I met, whom I'll call Ella, had been a doctor in Mexico but fled to the United States after she and her husband were victims of a violent crime there. Here in America 2 years ago, she found herself in jail after being rear-ended on the way home from a Gainesville grocery store. I was just buying milk, Ella says now. I begged the woman in the other car, please don't call the police, I'll be taken from my children, please. But the other driver, an Indian immigrant incidentally, was a stickler for the rules and insisted, over a torrent of pleas, on calling the cops. The young doctor was quickly arrested. From the back of a squad car, she managed to call her local church, which sent some American members of the congregation to the accident scene. The churchgoers were able to take the woman's American-born daughter home for her and alert her husband, but they couldn't prevent an arrest. Ella is a soft-spoken, frail woman with rail-thin arms who wears thick glasses and fine wire frames. She came to America after a pair of masked men broke into her home in a rural Mexican town, savagely beat her and her husband, and took everything they had, including all the pharmaceuticals for their medical practice, and threatened to kill her entire family if she went to the police. When she went to the police anyway, the authorities did nothing. They didn't even visit the crime scene. She quickly realized that the police and the criminals, if not actively in cahoots, were not exactly adversaries. Frightened, she and her husband moved to Mexico City, but that turned out to be not far enough. Quote, because they wore masks, I can never be sure, she says now. I was looking at every man on the street and wondering. I stopped going outside. Ella's husband had a brother who had long before moved to America and was living in Gainesville working in construction. So Ella and her husband decided to come to see him. They came on a tourist visa, but stayed hoping to make a better life. And then it turned out the husband was caught at a random stop, and he was deported. And then she ended up spending a couple of days in jail again later. While there, she was visited over and over by an ICE official who repeatedly waived the paper for her to sign. This paper was a sort of rights waiver. Once signed, leads to extradited deportation. This is a favored ICE tool called a stipulated order of removal. The usual pitch of an ICE official waiving a stip order in front of an immigrant is that the result, deportation, will be the same as it will be if you contest the case, only you'll spend less time in the ICE detention facilities and get to go to your home country faster. This waiver of rights was used to deport 160,000 people between 2000 and 2010. It is its use exploded after Obama's election, moving from fewer than 5,000 orders a year in 2004 to more than 40,000 in 2008. That's 8 times as many. Studies have shown that ICE officials routinely overestimate the amount of time detainees will spend in jail contesting their cases, and that STIPs are mostly presented to people who have been detained on minor violations and do not have lawyers. So ICE officials and ICE has been convinced by the Obama administration to put out these STIPs as much as you can, is basically what's happening. Encourage the STIP away, wrote another ICE official. A third attorney in the ICE counsel's office in San Francisco commented on the amount of time agents should spend reviewing STIP orders before presenting them to judges for final approval. He wanted the deportations to involve more speed and less thought. Quote, 15 minutes is way too long, he wrote. Cut that in half. So, the truth is, she's likely to lose her case and will almost certainly be deported soon. Her 7 children and her husband will almost certainly stay here in America, so she has a year left with her family, all because she got her fender nicked on the way to pick up some milk. The number of stories like this boggles the mind. 396,906 people were deported from the U.S. in 2011. Of these, just over 1,000 had records for homicide, and just under 6,000 had convictions for sexual offenses. Roughly 80,000 had other lesser convictions of offenses like DUIs. The overwhelming remainder were like Ella, people guilty of little civil infractions, what immigration authorities term level 3 offenses, traffic violations, immigration violations, and so on. In some communities like Georgia's Cobb County, 60% of all detainees were caught for traffic violations. Many of those people were deported through Rule 287G, which is only supposed to target immigrants who are, quote-unquote, a threat to public safety and a danger to the community. The rule was supposed to make it easier to deport Mexican murderers, but the distinction got lost in the wash. Instead, the people we are deporting are the ones who fled from Mexican murderers in the first place. Quote, Obama has broken all the deportation records, says Nibolas, that was the guy from before, 1 million people in just a few years. And if you guys remember correctly, he and Biden are the deporter-in-chiefs. They deported more people than even Trump did. And in fact, right now, I think we have more people in ICE detention facilities than we ever had under Trump. So again, this is one of those things where FDR probably, he's kind of a racist, but Biden is certainly very similar to Trump when it comes to immigration policy. Now, he's not separating kids from their parents, so I do give Biden credit on that. But I mean, again, it's like a D- effort when we could be doing so much better. So I'm going to talk to you guys now about Alvaro, the guy that ended up being deported, who was a Colombian, to Mexico. Alvaro's trip wasn't a long one. He moved to the North Georgia Detention Center run by a private company called the CCA, the Corrections Corporation of America. If that isn't dystopian as hell sounding, I don't know what is. The Corrections Corporation of America. The CCA facility in Gainesville is basically a retooled version of an old city jail. In fact, it shares a building with the Gainesville Police Department. The facility, surrounded by giant coils of razor wire, is inopportunely located in a new enterprise zone area of Gainesville, darkening the mood for the would-be yuppie-friendly coffee shop and poetry art center across the street. Still, the facility's presence in the zone isn't inappropriate. CCA represents one of the great enterprise models in this new phase of the American economy, which is rich in such public-private profit schemes. Alvaro's experience hints as to why. He moved from smelly jumpsuits and grimy blankets in the public jail to a Holiday Inn-like experience at the CCA. Depending on whom you believe, CCA receives upwards of $166 a day from the federal government to care for immigrants like Alvaro, which is about 4 times what it cost in the INS back in the days when the government took care of its own detainees. The big influx of cash impressed investors on Wall Street. Back in 2000, when the federal government began housing immigrant detainees in mostly private-run prisons, CCA's share price hovered around $1. Today, as I write this in the summer of 2013, CCA's share price is at $34.34. It was $23 just 2 years ago. The company's revenues went from just around $300 million in 2000 to an astonishing $1.7 billion in 2011. Oh my gosh. Overall, the corrections industry is one of the soundest stock equity bets in the world. With soaring revenues, the industry as a whole pulled in more than $5 billion in 2011 in America alone. So, and that's basically what happened. It shows why he was put into the CCA, and then he was actually deported from the CCA, and he ended up being dropped off in a city right over the border where he didn't know anybody. Luckily, he had 2 Mexican friends that he met while at CCA who were deported with him, where he was able to stay with them. He was also able to stay with like this old man. It turned out to be a really, really bad living situation though, because he was a bad drunk and he was like beating his wife. So he didn't stay there very long either. And then the next part that was so crazy was that there's a bunch of gangs at the border that realize that some of these people have people back in America, like family members or friends, that have the pockets to actually be able to pay for them to be transported back across the border. So they pick up a whole bunch of these people that have recently been deported, collect them, and find out which ones are valuable enough to, deport or sneak back into America. And it doesn't say what happened to the people that didn't get picked, but God, it's unbelievable. They're being collected in these like burnt out trailers, literally burnt out, meaning there was a fire inside and it's still a structure, but nothing works inside. Everything's charred, and there's like 50 people crammed into this thing waiting for some of these gang members to come grab them and take them to the border so they can be sold back over the border. So here we go. Okay, so he had $60 in his pocket and going off towards downtown Nuevo, which is where they dropped him off. Laredo with 2 young men. His first thought was to change his money. There was an exchange window right near the bridge. The exchange rate at the time was 12 pesos to the dollar. He pushed his $60 across. The woman handed him back 600 pesos, seemingly expecting he wouldn't notice she was shorting him 120. Quote, apparently a lot of the men who come across the bridge do not count so well, he says. It took some arguing, but I got my dollars back and we moved on. From there, Alvaro decided to get a hotel room with the 2 men until they could find relatives to come and get them. He was on his way to doing that when he decided to call his nephew back in Gainesville at a phone booth. The instant he dialed the States, he felt a pair of arms grabbing him from behind. I turned around, he said, and it was a policeman, a bicycle policeman, as it happened. His bike was leaning up against the wall. The 2 other young men Alvaro was with scattered when the policeman arrived. Meanwhile, the bike cop demanded that Alvaro identify himself and then told him he was under arrest. For what? He asked. For making an illegal phone call, the policeman said. The ticket, he said, was going to be 300 pesos. Alvaro stood his ground arguing with the bicycle policeman, who eventually gave up and went away. He shook his head and laughed. An illegal phone call? Watching this scene the whole time was an elderly man who was sitting at a shoe shine stand waiting for customers. When Alvaro was finally done with the policeman, the old man waved him over. He introduced himself, asked me where I was from. Alvaro says, I told him I've just come from up north. He says to me, you come with me, you'll be my guest for the night, forget about the hotel. So he stayed with the old man for a night or 2, but ended up finding out that he was abusive and alcoholic, so he didn't stay there for very long. But he did end up getting in contact with a man named Fitus, who he's the connection that finds a lot of these people that have been deported recently and gets in contact with the gangs and tells them who to go pick up. So Fitus got him in contact with the gang called the Zetas here. Here we go. The Zetas, Alvaro learned, operate on a simple business model. They know that most of the immigrants deported out of the United States have left relatives behind in America. Many of the deportees' relatives have saved money to bring more loved ones to the States from Mexico. That makes the deportees natural kidnapping targets. Alvaro asks some of the men there what their situation was. So he's actually been kidnapped by the Zetas, and he hasn't told them about Fitus yet. But he mentions his name right here, and then they get him in contact with the right people who are doing the sneaking of these people back into America for, I think it's $1,000, and then they upped it to $1,200 once they actually got him to the border. So they upcharged him along the way as well. So his captors took him aside. Quote, so the Zetas start asking me questions about who I am and what I'm doing. I tell them I'm not Mexican, I'm not like these men, I'm a Colombian and I'm heading north. They ask me who's helping you through, who's arranging this coyote, and that's a nickname for somebody who sneaks you back across the border. And that's when I got lucky. I told them Fidus was helping me, and that changed everything. Once he dropped Fidus's name, the Zetas disappeared, and they had a discussion. Soon they came back and told him, "Hang tight, we're gonna go check this out with Fidus." So Alvaro spent a whole day in captivity in the house outside Laredo with 25 other deportees. But Fidus vouched for Alvaro, and he was released from the haunted house. He has no idea what happened to the other men, and that's the one I was talking about, which was completely burned on the inside, but was just basically like a structure that all these people were jammed into. From there, Alvaro began the long journey back to America. He got money wired to Fidus's friends and was taken to a place in Nuevo Laredo called The Spot. It was like a safe house. There were 20 to 30 people in a filthy room. No ventilation, no bathrooms. These were people who wouldn't know what toilet paper is. I spent 3 days there. I had to sleep on a terrace outside because the mosquitoes on the first floor were so unbearable, Alvaro explained. So he eventually did make it back home. It took him over a month. And all of this extra money spent, the Zetas originally wanted $1,000. He had $1,000 set aside, and then they said no, $1,200 when they actually got him to the river to sneak him across the river and then let him off at the border. And along the way, they also, of the 20 or 30 people that he was with, when he crossed the border, they lost a bunch of children. They didn't know where they went. When a helicopter went over their heads, one of the younger guys, like, they don't know what happened to him because he was too weak to climb some of the fences that they had to climb, so they just left him. Like, they aimed him in the right direction to go back to the gangs, and, like, they don't know what happened to him after that. Let's see here. And this is the last part about Alvaro and how it turns out the abuse of the 287G and getting all of these people deported for basically no reason actually ended up hurting the bottom line of a lot of these cities that are on the border, like Gainesville. Not long after Alvaro returned to Gainesville, the city's local business leaders gathered together to discuss a problem. No one particularly minded that we were express mailing human beings into the hands of kidnappers on the other side of the border, but the deportations were bad for business. Turnover at the local chicken plants was at an all-time high. Good, dependable cleaning ladies were being disappeared. The instability of the workforce was becoming a problem for the local white folks. So in February 2011, some of those leaders marched on down to Atlanta to complain. Speaking before the state Senate, Special Committee on Immigration and Georgia's Economy, Tom Hensley, president of a chicken processing firm called Fielddale Farms that is a big presence in Gainesville, stood up and complained about 287G. Quote, we were 67% Hispanic in 2004. Our turnover rate was 25%. Our workers' compensation cost was $50,000 a month. Our health care cost for the whole year was $8 million. It was about that time that the federal, state, and local governments let it be known that these folks are not welcome. Fast forward to 2010, we're about 33% Hispanic now. Our turnover is 75%. Workers' comp is $150,000 a month, and our healthcare cost last year was $20 million. Those are staggering numbers, but that's the economic reality. Hensley closed by begging the committee to ease back on the profiling and no-license statutes. Quote, I implore you, don't pass any more laws. And basically a bunch of them complained, and they ended up having to admit that 287G was being abused. Let's see here. Here we go, John Morton. The leeway was in part provided by John Morton, the chief ICE and Barack Obama's top immigration official, responding to a hail of criticism from around the country over the sharp increase in deportations and 287G actions, and perhaps thinking ahead to the 2012 election where the Hispanic vote might prove important. The Obama administration decided through Morton to offer America's 12 million undocumented aliens an olive branch. On June 17, 2011, Morton issued a letter outlining a kinder, gentler immigration policy. The notorious Morton Memo, as it would come to be known, essentially said that ICE officials and their partners in local law enforcement did not necessarily have to deport every last undocumented alien who came within eyeshot of a police officer. Quote, agency employees, Morton wrote, may exercise prosecutorial discretion and what factors should be considered. It went on to say that certain mitigating circumstances may be considered in immigration cases, like the individual's pursuit of education or her service in the U.S. Armed Forces, and so on and so forth. Furthermore, special enforcement emphasis was to be placed on people who posed a clear risk of national security, like serious felons and known gang members. These, of course, were exactly the people for whom 287G was originally supposed to target. The Morton memo was essentially an admission that ICE had gone beyond its stated objectives and that had unfairly swept up hardworking non-criminals like Ella and Alvaro. Now, however, the administration's new promise was to focus more on real criminals. So what they go on to say is that, does that mean that they're going to do fewer dragnet patrol stops for these people? No, it just means that they're not going to deport a lot of them. They just slap them with other things, which they go on to say here are like fines, traffic fines. And that brings us to our last character, the young lady, Natividad, and how a lot of people that are here they're not documented, they're not allowed to get driver's licenses, and a lot of police will profile around places that are highly Latino, pull people over for nothing, find out that they don't have a license, and then take away their car and slap them with the impound fee for getting a car recovered is like $1,200. And they do this routinely as just a way of making money off of these people, but then you're not actually deporting them, you're just making life hell on them here by saying, no, you're not allowed to drive, and if you do drive, you're going to end up paying a lot of money. And so how are these people supposed to get to and from work? How are they supposed to get their kids to school sometimes if they can't drive? So that's what this is all about right here. Okay, Nadi's real problem wasn't what she'd done, and she was pulled over for no reason. She was being profiled, and they took her car away. Nadi's real problem wasn't what she'd done, but what she'd done when she had done it. It had actually been legal for an undocumented immigrant to obtain a driver's license until 1993. That was when then-Governor Pete Wilson signed into law SB 976, which granted licenses to those who had Social Security numbers and were authorized under federal law to be in the state of California. Natividad, like Alvaro, had once had a legal driver's license. In 2003, the then-Governor Gray Davis had signed into law a measure briefly repealing Wilson's ban on immigrant licenses. But the window of legality was shut by Arnold Schwarzenegger very shortly after Davis was ousted from office, and Natividad was again left without legal license. Years later, Governor Jerry Brown would again sign a law permitting undocumented residents to have driver's licenses. So at the time of her first car stop in 2007, this single mother of 6 was driving in a van with 4 of her children, and suddenly the lives of 7 people were hanging in the balance. Not because of what she had done, or that she had done anything inherently wrong, but because her state had recently changed governors. So, and then what they do is they seize your car, and you have to pay an impound fee to get it back. And what she would do is she just couldn't afford the $1,200. So instead she was just like, keep the damn car. I'll just save up money and buy a $500 car a year from now and hope I can just avoid being pulled over by the police. But as it goes on to say, they basically just set up these traffic stops near where they know people are going to church that are Latino, or where they work and they're Latino, whatever. And if your car happens to look ratty, they'll just pull you over. They know you're likely to not have a driver's license because you're not allowed to have them. And then they just take your car away, and they charge you an inordinate amount of money to get it back. So they make your life hell. Now, even if you're not getting deported back to Mexico, they just make it terrible in a numerous bunch of ways to live here as an undocumented immigrant. So that's what this whole chapter was about, guys. The next chapter is about the same length. It's called Border Trouble Part 2. I'll try to break it down again into the characters and the reasons behind, I think, why Matt Taibbi went over these characters' stories. And again, he's doing a great job at keeping it interesting. It's very, like, sort of Hunter S. Thompson-like. His writing is very funny at times. It keeps you engaged in what would otherwise be very dry material, and I feel like it teaches you something along the way. So I highly recommend The Divide by Matt Taibbi. We'll go over the next chapter in the next week or so. I need time to read it and then kind of probably reread it and organize my thoughts into an episode. So give me about a week, guys, and then we'll get back to it. Hope you enjoyed that. Keep fighting the good fight out there. I'll see you later.